Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is United States History 201, Presentation 3, the Southern Colonies, meaning Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia, and Celtic culture. So we've talked about Virginia, we've talked about Cavalier culture, so now we're going to look at the rest of the South. And, of course, Celtic culture being a major component of Southern culture. We're going to talk about that in the same kind of detail we talked about Cavalier culture. So we're going to start with Maryland. A lot of people don't think Maryland's a Southern colony, but it was. In fact, Maryland was initially founded by a man named George Calvert. He's the first Lord Baltimore. He is Catholic, and you can see he dies in 1632, and that's actually the same year that King Charles I granted George Calvert land in the New World to have a colony ostensibly for English Catholics. So there were a lot of Catholics in the gentry, the nobility, who did not convert over to Protestantism when Henry VIII and the Protestant Reformation in England decided that England was going to be a Protestant country. And so these people hung around, and Charles I's wife, Henrietta Maria, was Catholic. She was a French Catholic woman. And so he's fairly sympathetic to the Catholics, in fact, secretly rumored to be Catholic. Maryland, the name Maryland actually is named in honor of Charles I's wife, Henrietta Maria. And so we have this colony that's being set up to have these Catholics from England have a place to go. But, of course, George Calvert dies in 1632, so his son, Cecilius Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore, is going to be the man in charge of setting up the colony. Now, he is the proprietor of the Maryland colony for over 40 years. And so Maryland was a proprietary colony, meaning that the Calvert family controlled the everyday activities of the colony into the 1670s. The first settlement was established at St. Mary's in 1634. It did have some Jesuit monks and other settlers there. So Maryland was going to be a Catholic colony, and it was going to be a place where Catholics from England could go to worship freely and to also set up the lifestyle they had in England. I mean, that was the point. These people were all men of the nobility, and so the upper class, the gentry. And so they were going to live like the Cavaliers in England. They all were Cavaliers. But there would be Catholic and Protestant troubles in Maryland. As you might imagine, Maryland's on the northern part of Virginia, and so there were already Protestants living in what's now Maryland when the Catholic colony was established, and they didn't take too kindly to being controlled by Catholics. And so you're going to have you're going to have a civil war in Maryland that mirrors a civil war in England. England went through a civil war in the 1640s, and Charles I actually lost his head over it. It was between the Catholic Cavaliers, or traditional Anglican Cavaliers, and the parliamentarians, or the Roundheads, who were Puritans. And we'll talk about the Puritans with the next section. But remember, William Berkeley, who was the governor of Virginia, hated Puritans. He couldn't stand them. And so that was this big debate, this big battle. You're going to have it here in the what will become the United States and the British North American colonies. So you had Southerners who were generally in favor of the king, and Northerners in Massachusetts who were generally parliamentarians or Puritans. And so that battle is still going to be here. So this north-south split takes place long before you even have the issue of slavery interjected into this or anything else. This is cultural, which is very important to understand. Now, between 1684 and 1695, Maryland will ultimately be wrestled from the Calverts and converted to a royal colony directed by the king. So what that means is that the king, the crown, now has control of the colony. And what's really interesting about that is that once it becomes a royal colony, the Catholics cannot vote in Maryland. So here is a colony that was established by Catholics for Catholics to be able to vote freely and participate in government. And the voting rights for Catholics will not be restored until around the American War for Independence, actually in 1776. So this is amazing that the colony that started this way actually went in that direction. And so some of the most powerful families, the Carrolls, for example, could not vote in Maryland, even though the colony was established for them, for Catholics. So let's talk about the Carolinas. The Carolinas was also a proprietary colony, and it had a large group of proprietors, but the most important was a man named Anthony Ashley Cooper, the Earl of Shaftesbury, who lived from 1621 to 1683. Anthony Ashley Cooper was the founder of the English Whig Party and a patron of John Locke. So a patron meaning that he paid John Locke to do things, to write treatises and other things. But he was a leader of 8 proprietors for a new colony in North America that they called the Carolinas. And they came up with a constitution called the Fundamental Constitutions for this new colony. He wrote this with John Locke, and it guaranteed things like religious freedom, a militia, so they had the right to bear arms, guaranteed, or I should say protected by the Constitution. The right to bear arms is guaranteed because you're an Englishman, but they protected it. in the first Constitution for the Carolinas. And it also established a hereditary aristocracy. These people were Cavaliers. And there's no doubt about it, Cooper was a man of the gentry. He's the Earl of Shaftesbury. The first settlement was called Charlestown, which it was called that from 1669 to 1680. And it would be on the Ashley and Cooper rivers, named after Anthony Ashley Cooper. Now, the Carolinas would have some problems. They would have Indian problems on the frontier. They would have some trade problems. And, of course, they would be tied into New England in this. In fact, what's really interesting is that the Carolinas, which were so important in the agricultural pursuits, mainly rice, indigo, and cotton, Sea Island cotton, New England is going to be one of their major areas of trade. And, of course, the two sections eventually tying together with the slave trade, which is fairly interesting. And then there's also some political disputes between the large and small landowners. And eventually, because of that, in 1729, North and South Carolina were split, becoming royal colonies, and all proprietors would sell their claims. So, just like the other proprietary colonies, which were controlled by an individual or group of individuals, eventually the Carolinas becomes a royal colony, or North and South Carolina become royal colonies. Georgia, last of the southern colonies, was established by James Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe lived from 1696 to 1785. Georgia was designed to be a place that would be different from the rest of the South. For example, there were restrictions. Oglethorpe wanted debtors and artisans to be able to come to Georgia. You did have a situation in England where you had something called debtor's prison. If you got into debt and you couldn't pay it, you went to prison until your debt was forgiven. And so this was seen as inhumane, and so a lot of these people were allowed to come to Georgia. It was an agrarian colony. These people were going to have a certain amount of land. They were going to be able to farm that land, but there would be no slaves, no rum, and no Catholics. So it was kind of a utopian experiment, so to speak. It wasn't, some historians say this is a communist experiment. It wasn't. It was a utopian experiment that fell apart almost immediately after it was put into effect. So in 1732, a settlement will be established in Georgia at Savannah and St. Simon's Island, which that St. Simon's Island settlement, part of it is still there in Georgia today, but of course Savannah is also there. Savannah was a planned city. If you go to Savannah, you'll see it's designed into squares with park areas. And almost immediately after Oglethorpe founds the colony, a lot of the prohibitions started falling apart. So there were restrictions on land size, and those restrictions fell apart. So the South Carolinians started moving into Georgia and buying up more and more land. So that restriction had to go away. They brought their slaves with them, so that restriction had to go away. Eventually, rum was allowed back in the colony, so that restriction went away. The Catholic restriction stayed in effect for a while, but in reality, Georgia's utopian experiment falls apart. It's also important to note that Georgia was kind of a buffer between the Spanish and the English. That was another design for Georgia. But Georgia was unique in that way, that it was kind of this different colony to begin with, but eventually followed the same patterns of the other southern colonies in terms of development. And by 1751, Oglethorpe gave the colony up to the crown and it became a royal colony. So that ended the Georgia experiment. Now, let's talk about the Celts. So, as I mentioned before, there are four distinct cultural groups: the Cavaliers, Puritan, Friends, or Quakers, and Celts. And the Celts are going to settle primarily in the South, and they're looking for wealth. And so that particular trend is going to be important, this movement of Celtic peoples into the South and into the southern colonies. There were Celtic peoples in, say, Pennsylvania and some of those areas. In Pennsylvania, maybe a little bit in New York, but not as much. But most of your Celtic people is going to settle in places like Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and they're going to move to the Piedmont area, the backwater area, the back country. And Southern culture is very much influenced by the Celts. So Southern culture really is a mix of Cavalier, Celtic, and African heritage. Cavaliers would dominate Southern colonial politics, but the Celtic peoples had an impact on the frontier. So the question is, who are the Celts? They came from North Britain, meaning Ireland and Scotland, and there were successive waves of migration, not all at once, but over time, large numbers of people, and most people came with thoughts of material betterment. They're going to get some land, they're going to make some money, they're going to do better for themselves here than they did over in the British Isles. And they're a mixed group of people from all classes in society. Some people were indentured servants, some people had money, and so they could come over here and establish themselves and set up plantations. Different religions, different ancestry, different social ranks, but they would all settle in the back country for the most part, meaning the mountains and the Piedmont regions of the South. Now, again, let's look at the different speech ways. So The Southern Highland speech is now the dominant dialect for country western singers and cinematic cowboys. So if you think about that accent, that's what you're talking about with the Celtic speech. So instead of saying fire, you said far. Instead of saying naked, you said naked. Instead of saying widow, you said widder. Youngins for young ones. Fixin' for getting ready to do something. You won't find anyone outside the South that says they're fixing to get ready to do something. Or I'm fixing to go to the store. I'm fixing to do this or fixing to do that. People in the North are going to look at you like you're crazy. Cute for attractive, scoot for slide, honey as a term of endearment, and sexual processes and natural functions were freely used in everyday language and figurative expression. So the Celtic peoples loved to curse. In terms of building ways, they had cabins and cow pens, and it was said these people live in log cabins with hardly a blanket to cover them. Most slept on the floor, which was dirt. They didn't even construct wood floors. They had dirt floors. There's very little privacy in Celtic culture. Nakedness, one traveler said, is counted as nothing. And their outbuildings for cattle were called cow pens, which is basically a pen for cows. That's what it means. So very humble dwellings. This is how the majority of the people in the South lived. The majority of the people in the South did not live on these large plantations in the States like you would think of in Gone with the Wind. And we'll look at this stuff as we move forward in the class. We get further down the line. We'll look at Southern culture, but most people were living like this. So this is a typical Southern homestead. You can see maybe a one-room log cabin, and there's that will have a number of people in it. Maybe an outbuilding, a cow pen. They might have added on that cabin, or they could have had a dog trot style cabin. This is actually a cabin over in Fort Mitchell. And there are two rooms, and you have that breezeway in the middle. But dog trot cabins were the typical, kind of middle class building, or kind of working class building in the South. This is how most people lived, and that's another thing we get into Southern society when the issue of slavery comes up, and you look at the buildings that slaves had. A lot of Southerners couldn't understand the critique of the living conditions for slaves because most of the people in the South had the same kind of living standards. The plantation owners did not, of course. They lived very well. But the typical Southerner lived in something like this. This is the Muskogee County Trader's Cabin. This is the kind of cabin, if I just go back a couple pictures, if you look at that picture of that cabin and then look at this cabin, this is what people lived in. One room, and that was it. So this is the oldest building from Muskogee County, Georgia. It was built in the 1700s. And this is what Southerners had for the most part. And so they weren't elaborate buildings. They lived in log cabins, and that's very important to note. And most of your Celtic peoples lived in stuff like this. They hardly had any utensils. They hardly had any furniture. They had dirt floors. Really wasn't a whole lot to the life. And you lived outside. You went hunting. You did a little farming. This is a hard life. Now, in terms of marriage, you had voluntary and involuntary abductions, and I put David Crockett there because David Crockett was a member of the Celtic Society, Celtic culture. He was a young man that had a hard time finding a wife, and in fact, at one point, when he finally had a woman agree to marry him, he was going to have to abduct her because her mother would not allow her to get married. She was a young teenager. I mean, Crockett was only, 17, and she was only about 15. But the mother wasn't going to let it happen, and eventually the father interjected, and they did. But Crockett was going to go abduct her. So, this actually became part of the wedding ceremony. The groom would go into the house, kick the door in, throw the bride over his shoulder, throw her on the horse, and take her to the ceremony. So this was, this whole idea of abduction was part of the ceremony. And these things were wild parties of shooting, drinking, kissing, and dancing. And so they were a lot of fun, right? The tradition of the garden and the bouquet came out of Celtic society, and marriage parties could last for days. In fact, the entire community was invited to the ceremony, not just your close friends and family, but everybody in the community came to the wedding party. And so it was a grand time for the community when people got married. In terms of gender ways, men were warriors and women were workers. That was the way it was seen. Both sexes, though, shared in heavy labor. Men dominated the families, and there were sharp distinctions between masculine and feminine roles, but that didn't mean that women didn't contribute in this society. In fact, there were very intense expressions of love and violence between husband and wife. And it was a very open sexual society. There were very high rates of premarital pregnancy and really no concern with privacy. And women and men both displayed their sexuality quite openly. So in terms of getting married, people got married at a much younger age. Early to late teens is when most of the people in Celtic society were getting married. And so that people often make fun of the South for that. People get married so young, but this is part of that Celtic culture, and we talked about that with blood sports and say Michael Vick and dog fighting, and that's where that comes from. It has nothing to do with race or religion. It's culture, and this stuff has been ingrained for hundreds of years. So it's only over time and a way we think about things today that this is kind of changed in the United States. But Northerners got married at a much later age. Southerners, because of their cultural traditions, were getting married much younger. In terms of child-rearing ways, building the will. Children had to have their wills built, and children had immense freedom. Again, I bring up Crockett because Crockett would just go out for days and when he was a young boy, and the parents wouldn't really think much of it. He'd go out hunting, and he'd be gone for a few days. When he was just barely even a teenager, 12 years old, 11 years old, he's out and wandering around the wilderness. You would never let your kids do this today, but this is what happened back in this period of time. Boys were to have a fierce pride, stubborn independence, and a warrior's courage. Girls were expected to have industry, obedience, patience, sacrifice, and devotion to others. And so you can see a definite gender role system here, even from the time they're boys and girls. And it was a warrior caste system, meaning the best soldiers, the best warriors often were the most respected men in the community. And I bring up Andrew Jackson because he was seen as a very harsh individual, a strong fighter, someone you didn't want to tangle with. Crockett, same thing. Crockett was a great shot, and so these people had a lot of respect because of their ability for the martial arts. The Celts had an intense hostility to organized churches and clergy, but a genuine interest in religion. Most backcountry men were Presbyterians, though, so even though they didn't really believe in organized churches, most of them were Presbyterians. And generally they had what were called field meetings. They might not have had an official church, but they would have kind of a minister come in and minister to the people in a field. And this is why the Great Awakenings took hold so well in the South, because you would have these traveling ministers come in. And we'll talk about the Great Awakenings. The Second Great Awakening, most importantly, had the impact here. This is when the Puritans would really come into the South and bring with them Methodism and the Baptist Church, and in some cases the Presbyterians. So this is why today you have the Baptist Church and the Methodist Church so popular in the South, because they were receptive to it. It was very democratic. The Congregationalist churches are just very open, very easy to become a member of that particular denomination, and so that appealed to the Celtic peoples who really didn't care for organized churches very much. In terms of foodways, these people had a very poor diet. They ate clabber, which is spoiled milk, butter, fatty bacon, potatoes, cornbread, whiskey, and water. One traveler said it's an animal's diet. Boiling was the common method of cooking, but they had one pot usually, so they did everything with that pot, cleaning, cooking, everything. And that way dirt was seen as an essential for a good meal. The more hair in your butter, the better, and the more dirt, the less hurt, is how they used to say it. So these people did not eat very well, and they ate some pretty nasty stuff. Young unmarried women tended to dress in tight clothes and short skirts. Ministers often complained they revealed far too much, particularly when they played a game where they would get on the tables and kick their skirts up in front of the unmarried and the younger boys, and they wondered why there were high rates of premarital pregnancy. Older women and married women covered more. Men wore shirts that emphasized their shoulders and chests to outline their masculinity, and they also wore what were called leather stockings, which they took from the Indian tribes. It was basically chaps and a cover over your groin, so it emphasized your groin area. Children really didn't wear many clothes and no shoes at all, so imagine little kids walking around in a diaper. That's what you basically had in Celtic society. The Celts loved war games, shooting matches, fighting matches, wrestling, fighting. What they really liked were rough and tumble matches where everything went, right? There were no rules. And so maiming was quite an important part of that. And these are the fights they really wanted to see. And of course, every fight involved a little bit of bragging and boasting beforehand. You had your second go out and talk about how great you were and how tough you were. You see this nowadays in professional wrestling. You see it in MMA. I mean, this is where this stuff comes from. This is this Celtic culture now manifesting itself in American sport. They loved athletic contests, running, jumping, throwing matches. They also loved shooting matches. And again, David Crockett was an expert shot. He made a lot of money. And one of his only possessions when he was a young man was a rifle. And he was able to use that to make some money. Most men preferred war to work. They liked to hunt. I put Daniel Boone as also a member of this culture, the Celtic culture. Daniel Boone spent a lot of time on the frontier. He was known as a great hunter. Spent a lot of time on the frontier. In fact, this is how Kentucky was founded, by hunters, basically, and Boone was one of those hunters. They did engage in some agriculture. They had infields and outfields. Infields were for your subsistence crops, the stuff you had to eat to survive, and outfields were cash crops if you had any of those. They did have some small-scale manufacturing of clothing and other things, but it must be said that men and women did the work together, hard work included. And women definitely had a more difficult lot. If their husband was sick, they had to do their work and their husband's work, and most of the time they were pregnant through all of this. So they had a hard time. If somebody was needed to be taken care of, they had to do that. They had to do all the interior chores, the infield chores. The husband would go out hunting, but the wife definitely had a tougher time. And this is why women died much younger than men in this period of time, because they did have the harder work. They had to rear children, breed children, birth children, and do all their work. They didn't get any maternity leave or anything like that. As soon as they birthed the children, they're back up working. Land was the most important commodity in Celtic society, and so if you could get land, you'd be well off. But most did not have land, and most were squatters or tenants. It means they just kind of lived on the land, but they didn't own it. You did have a small middle-class yeomanry, and you had a few large landowners, but again, this was a class or caste system, so class mattered. How much money you had mattered. Order was retributive justice. So there was a saying that every man should be a sheriff of his own hearth, and a nice example of that, the Hatfields and McCoys. You've heard that story before, but when there was a family squabble, it turned bloody and violent, and they didn't really care about the external law, the governor of Kentucky or Tennessee. They didn't really care about that. What they cared about was taking care of it themselves. And if you agreed to fight, you had to win. So that meant that these squabbles could go on forever, because they were going to keep fighting until the other side was completely routed. It's a very violent culture, family violence included. Husband and wives would duke it out just like other people would. And in terms of power and liberty, for our last slide, these people did believe in personal government, though. They didn't want any outside intervention. They believed in strong personal leadership. Their clans or families and small communities mattered, and your personal relationship with people mattered. Your respect for other people mattered. They believed in natural freedom, meaning shunning law and authority and order. They didn't really care for a central authority coming in and telling them what to do. So they believed in minimal government, like taxes, and armed resistance to tyranny. You didn't violate somebody's honor and their family, or you'd have to face, just like their order ways, you'd have to face justice. And they thought they could take care of everything themselves. So this strain of thought definitely has an impact in the South today, and it's moved into kind of the West. But this is where it comes from. It's cultural. People just think that the South just thinks about this stuff, and where does it come from? Well, it's just fabricated. These people just make this stuff up. No, it's been ingrained in Southern society for hundreds of years, and it will continue to be there. So you have, in the United States, different sections and different cultures in these sections, and that's the most important thing to get out of this. Everything we're looking at today, there's the red states, blue states, north, south, west coast, and center, flyover zone, all that's there because of these original cultures, and it's so important for the future fabric of the United States. All right, we'll see you at presentation 4 next time.